So I just finished Superman and Batman versus Vampires and Werewolves, which is a mouthful of a title, and it's also quite a title. Honestly, I was just interested in this for the title alone. I mean, how could you not want to see that? Superman and Batman fighting vampires and werewolves. As far as I know, this is a self-contained little mini-series, potentially a graphic novel. I read it in a trade. You know, it's all together in one book for me. But it certainly seemed as though there were issues, sort of separating them and stuff. So, as far as I know, it's a mini-series. Could be a graphic novel, I don't know. Point being, I read the entire story. I think it's around six issues, chapters, whatever. Like I said, depending on what it is. And I'll be honest, it could have been better. It really doesn't live up to what it could have been. And I guess I'll just go into it. This is going to be full spoilers. Pretty much all my comic videos are. Because, as far as I'm concerned, you can read this pretty quickly, then come back here. But long story short, I was immediately, I sort of immediately noticed the narration. There is a massive overuse of narration in this comic, and it is omniscient. Well, not even omniscient. It is semi-omniscient narration, meaning that they know, or the narrator knows the thoughts of characters, but sometimes he doesn't. It's very inconsistent as far as that goes. Sometimes the narrator knows exactly what the characters are thinking, sometimes he doesn't, and sometimes he knows what's going on, sometimes he doesn't. It's very inconsistent, very sort of lazy style of writing, which definitely put a damper on the comic immediately. Because this comic doesn't really have pacing. The pacing is very bad. Basically, it'll sort of go between these different scenarios with different characters, and the narrator will sort of introduce it, and then it'll happen, and then we'll go back to the main story, and sort of rinse and repeat throughout. It sort of just jumps between a bunch of different things going on, and there's not really there definitely is a story, but the story gets randomly interrupted a few times throughout, which takes you out of it, despite some of the scenes being kind of cool on their own. Like, there's a scene with Wonder Woman, who is being attacked in a park by like a vampire, or was it a werewolf? I don't know. I think it was a werewolf. But that part's really cool. I like that part a lot. That whole confrontation actually was really cool. But within the context of the story, I thought that part was a little bit out of place, despite it coming back later and it being the first real example of these, for lack of a better word, cutaways. But like I said, if that was just a one-shot, if DC had just published that, like, maybe as an addendum, like at the end of this book or something like that, like as an epilogue or something, like this was happening too, and it was just this little 4-page thing, sort of tertiarily added on. I think that scene could have been really cool, and the scene is cool when you separate it from everything else, but it really does come out of nowhere, and it sort of messes with the flow of the story, and all of these little cutaways really do. And so that's a big issue right away. And like I said, the narration, just very lazy. I feel like, and this is very bad for a comic book. If you're gonna make a comic, you have to use the conventions of a comic book. You have to use, you don't want your story to be able to be told in any other way. Ideally. And the way that the narration was so overused in this comic really does, I feel like, I haven't double checked this to make to make sure it's true, but it certainly feels like you could probably just isolate the narration and read the narration like as a novel, and I think you would get most of what's going on, which is very bad for a visual medium like comics. You know, I mean, you get all the punching and all that in the actual panels, but as far as story goes, for the most part, the big developments are just told to you via the narrator, even when they do happen in the panels themselves, you know, with the dialogue bubbles and everything, and there's visual stuff going on, the narrator will just recap what you just saw play out. So the narration is just immediately one of the biggest things wrong with this comic. Which is not to say that there aren't cool things. Like I said, I like the Wonder Woman scene a lot. That's actually probably my favorite scene in the whole thing, despite the fact that it sort of messes up the tone or whatever. That Wonder Woman scene is really cool. I can't iterate that enough. The Wonder Woman scene is very cool as like a one-shot thing, if you just isolate that. And there's some other cool moments. There's some good bits of gore in here. This is a mature rated comic book or whatever, so you know, you do get to see Batman and Superman like fight real vampires, real werewolves, you know, like that they're not holding back. Although I actually think it could have been gorier, to be entirely honest, because I feel like it's randomly gory in spots. Like, it'll sort of be standard comic book violence, then out of nowhere, like, you'll see guts fly out, and it's like, oh well. If there was more of that, maybe that would have worked better, because it's sort of cool on its own. Once again, I mean, there's elements of this that are cool on their own, but in the context of the overall product, it really does feel weird. It really does feel weird for there to be sort of standard Superman punching, and then suddenly, like, you see an eyeball fly out, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess that's happening. That sort of took me out of it a little bit. Even though if you just took that image on its own and you showed it to me, I'd be like, that's sick. Yeah. Which I can't say for a lot of the art, by the way. I can't say that the art is sick for the most part. Art was just not for me. It was really jumbled. The character designs weren't that well done. The creature designs weren't very cool looking. This whole thing just feels very, just very poorly handled. And this is just such a, like I said before, it's such a premise that instantly sounds super cool, and you're like, oh, how could they possibly do this wrong? It's Superman and Batman literally fighting vampires and werewolves, but they, you know, needless to say, they do it wrong. And they do it wrong in just about every way they could possibly do it wrong. As far as like other character cameos are concerned, Green Arrow comes in, and his part's actually kind of neat. I like what he was doing. He had the wooden arrow tips that he was like shooting at vampires, because, you know, wooden stakes. That was kind of creative. Was there anything else creative going on? There's a part where Batman insinuates that, but Batman doesn't kill anything, even werewolves, obviously, but he insinuates to a werewolf character that Brass Knuckles could kill them, and I think that's kind of interesting. Silver Knuckles, rather, because, you know, silver bullets kill a werewolf, so why wouldn't any form of silver kill him? But really, there is just a lack of any interesting ideas going on aside from the stuff I just mentioned. It's a very basic plot. Like, the plot is almost like insultingly basic. The villain is boring. Yeah, the villain is super duper boring. It's just the most standard mad scientist guy ever. He has occult ties. Ooh. Which, I mean, once again, that's kind of a cool idea, right? If you're like, oh man, it's a mad scientist who, like, was obsessed with the occult. It's like, okay, that could be neat. And then it's not, because they just make him a mad scientist, and then randomly there will be, like, I don't know, like a spooky image or something that he conjures up, and it's like, okay, well, once again, like, I feel like this comic just constantly has almost interesting ideas or interesting ideas, and then it just doesn't deliver on them. And it'll just resort to just generic Superman, Batman, comic book tropes, basically. It really doesn't do much with the premise it sets out for itself. Really, it's just an excuse to see overlong, poorly paced action sequences and the most predictable plot you could possibly imagine. And that's really what it comes down to. I was not a fan of Superman and Batman versus Vampires and Werewolves, and no, I don't recommend it at all, needless to say.